technical help? Do you know where that is? Let me just point it out to someone. Maybe you could not there and I could turn on what Okay. So we've been talking about networks here. So networks are going to take us through a set of different issues. I'd like you to, well, if you had AnyLogic up, I would have you load in a model right now. But absent that, we'll wait to see how this resolves, and then we'll go and load it in if we can open that cabinet up. So, sorry?
Help center's closed.
Okay. No, we'll have to do without that here. So, you may recall the role of the environment in AnyLogic. Can anyone tell me what role does the environment play? What does it govern? What information does it contain in AnyLogic? Okay, it defines the location, it defines the network connectivity. So both of those are features of the environment. Alex, special delivery. So we have spatial characteristics and network environment specified in AnyLogic. We're going to talk about the interaction between the two, because networks can sometimes depend on spatial location. The existence of a connection between two people. In other words, the topology, who is connected to whom, can depend on spatial location. And sometimes the spatial location can depend on the topology. We're going to see how this gets done in AnyLogic. And then probably next time, depending on timing of this works, we're going to dive deep into one particular type of network, which is called a scale-free network. Okay? These sorts of networks are of great interest theoretically. They describe everything from the structure of the internet to patterns associated with people's contact with each other, and some natural systems. And we're going to talk about scale-free networks in particular. But first, I want to give you a glimpse of several types of networks with AnyLogic that it supports, because they're the most important types theoretically. So we're going to be talking about networks, and we're going to be talking about them in conjunction with spatial layouts. So there's two distinct node attributes. The node's location, in other words, the geometric context of the node on the one hand, and then secondly, the node's connections, that is, its topological context, who it's connected to. Spatial layouts within AnyLogic will determine where nodes appear in space, and network type determines who is connected to who. And for the most part, these characteristics are determined independently. So if we go to something like this, and we look under advanced, we have these spatial layouts, and we have the network here. For the most part, those are fairly distinctive characteristics. Network topologies, as we'll see, will sometimes interact with the layouts. So within AnyLogic, and again, if we could get into that case, so near yet so far, we have layouts, and these can be chosen to be a couple of different things. By default, they're random. In other words, nodes are scattered around randomly. They can, however, be arranged, in which case they're arranged in a grid type of fashion. They can be arranged in a ring lattice, in which case they're connected with some number of individuals to either side. Excuse me. This is the layouts, in which case they're arranged in a ring. Connectivity will be decided by the network features, but they're arranged in a ring, or they can be arranged in a fashion that depends on their connectivity. So here's the different types of layouts. This determines people's position or the agent's position. Random, arranged, ring, spring mass, and user-defined. Ring is essentially a 1D structure. It's sort of arranged in a ring that's lined up on the screen. And as I said, arranged is normally a 2D grid. You can set your own if you see fit. We're now going to talk about connectivity, and we're going to see 2 points of overlap conceptually where connectivity starts to interface with the issue of location. So the first of these is distance-based networks. So with the distance-based network, who is connected with who depends on where they're located. Two people are considered connected if and only if they exist within a certain distance of each other. When I say people, I mean two agents. Okay? And such networks are made to sort of mirror connectivity in 2D landscapes. The idea is you have neighbors, and those neighbors are people to whom you contact, who often have disproportionate impact on your behavior, for example. So studies have shown, for example, people's behavior is disproportionately impacted by people nearby them. In close physical proximity, people are much more likely to be influenced by each other, even compared to someone who's you might consider very emotionally close, but is located at a distance. Turns out spatial proximity has a disproportionate impact on behavior. And networks that are distance-based may be discontinuous in some cases. They may be divided into disjoint components. For example, if the threshold is small for connectivity, you need to be very close to me for me to be connected to you. And if the density of the space is too small. In other words, if people are only scattered around, on average, they're going to be at quite some distance, and you need a larger threshold to connect you. So it's really this issue of density and threshold that leads to dictating whether one person is connecting to another. For this issue of distance-based networks within AnyLogic, connectivity is based on location. Two people are connected if and only if they're located within a certain distance of one another. So distance-based connection. And what you get is something like this. Okay. Now, I have a model that I was hoping to run today, which will show some consequences of this, which are significant, but we may have to delay that until the beginning of next session. Here's a distance-based layout. You notice all the connections are quite localized. So we have these little clusters that are connected there. There doesn't happen to be a bridging individual here, hence these two are not connected. These sort of components, so-called components here, which are disconnected, are have the fact that we have multiple components is of significance. Among other things, it would mean a given process that's operating across the network within a component won't be able to, for example, to cross the barrier over here. So maybe it's influence associated with some idea, maybe it's some effect associated with the pathogen spread, but you're not going to have transmission. So you could have these folks, for example, infected, and these folks over here quite isolated from it. This is going to lead to big effects in terms of percolation. Connectivity leads to connectivity between two components is going to allow processes to be coupled and one thing to go to the other. And there needs to be at least a certain density of connections for a given process to sweep across the landscape. For example, for an infection to spread across the landscape, you need a certain critical density of connections, and boom, you can have it spread, and it won't blow there. We're going to see some implications of that and how it jives with some historical data. So in this case, in AnyLogic, and again, I prefer to walk you through this interactively, within the environment, if we select the Advanced tab, we can go to these network properties, and for distance-based network, the connection range is the operative parameter. For each type of network, you'll have different parameters different combinations of parameters being relevant. For example, for a random network, a Poisson random network, connections per agent is irrelevant. Here, this is grayed out. You can't really see it on your screen, but on mine, this one is grayed out, this one, and this one. So only this one is relevant. Okay. They're not used for this type of network. In other words, they're not germane. These parameters are relevant to another type of network. Okay. They're disabled. Okay, so a distance-based network represents localized connectivity in 2D. You're connected with nearby people. That's of interest because a lot of physical phenomena are localized in their character. They affect things in the local area. You don't get this sort of spooky action at a distance. By contrast, a ring lattice network, which by which we have local connectivity, also exhibits local connectivity in 1D space. Okay, so distance-based network has local connectivity in 2 space, in other words, in 2 dimensions, x and y. Ring lattice is local connectivity in 1 dimension. Agents are arranged in a ring. Connections by a given agent occur to neighboring individuals within that ring. It may be immediate neighbors or maybe neighbors at several neighbors down, but it's local neighbors. And it's in this 1D space. So there's a serialization of the individuals. That is, there's an ordering of the individuals which loops back around at the end. Now, this is going to have very significant impact on something like contagion, such as infection spread. So you have slow propagation of that because you have no shortcuts from one region to another. In order to get from A to B, it has to pass through the successive members. If it's purely local connectivity one-to-one, you're only connected to your immediate neighbors that have to go each person at a time. Now this is most naturally displayed with the ring layout type, but it doesn't have to be. You could have ring lattice in a grid, for example, and AnyLogic. There's nothing incompatible with that. It's easy to just visualize if things are laid out in a ring themselves. In other words, if the agents are themselves laid out visually, that is spatially in a ring, you could see much more easily what's going on in a ring lattice because you could see the neighbors topologically or neighbors geometrically as well. Does that make sense? So this is a ring lattice with no ring layout. This is with a random layout. There is a 1D connectivity here. Neighbors are just connected with others that are neighboring topologically, but it's all scrambled. You can't really see what's topologically a neighbor to someone except by the fact that there's a connection. There's no geometric significance of neighboring connectivity here. This would be what it looks like when it's in a ring lattice, a ring layout. So the ring layout allows you to sort of group members, and as you can imagine, if an infection starts, say, here, it will spread out successively, and it's a slow process. It has to go person by person by person to spread into the entire population, sort of an O of N process. Okay. So we can choose a ring layout in the layout type by contrast with a distance, or a random layout, which would be what results in that. So this is a ring lattice layout. Okay, so those are 2 localized types of networks. One in 2 space, distance-based network, which will exhibit some interesting properties. We'll see. One a ring network where we're connected with neighbors in 1 space. Essentially, it's a locally 1D structure. So to make a generating lattice, all we do is with AnyLogic, and I'll show you here so you can see it interactively. If we go to something like main here, and we open up the, all we have to do is find the environment here, which I put over to the side so it doesn't obscure the view when I'm running it. We have something like this. And then we have a layout type and a network type. So we could here select ring lattice network, and that will determine the connectivity. If I want to have it laid out visually, that is spatially, have the spatial mapping of that, then I would have to select the ring here. So if you choose ring lattice here, in the network type, what it's going to be doing is it's going to be imposing a ring structure on the population. What it will probably do, I'm just thinking what I would do algorithmically, I would number each person in the population from 1 to n, and I would go and connect person, I to I plus, well, okay, I number them from 0 to n, just for convenience, and then I would go connect person I to I plus 1 mod n, and I minus 1 mod n. And so 0 will be connected to 1 and to n, etc. Okay, come on. There's an off by one thing with that, because it wouldn't be mod n, it would be mod. If it's 0 to n minus 1, that's much better. 0 to n minus 1, then it would be connect I to I plus 1 mod n and to I minus 1 mod n. Boom, done. Does that make sense?
Is there a way to control that?
Well, in the sense of, first of all, you can connect to different numbers of agents. Here, the connections per agent and the connections on either side. So here you can determine, do I connect to one person on each side, 2 persons on each side, 3. But I think what you're asking is, can you control who is connected with who? The answer is twofold. First of all, I believe that is how it does it from some 0 to n minus 1, although I'd have to check. And so you could control the ordering of agents. That would be one way. The second thing you could do is write your own algorithm and just do instead a network type that's user defined, and then just impose it yourself. So, for example, we end up using a lot of custom networks, and we're usually playing around with custom networks because of network dynamics. So in other words, we're going to be adding people. This is just kind of an initial state, and then as the network evolves, you might want to add people in and so on. And at some point, you may just want to write your own algorithm to create it. Okay. So this is not a restriction. It just makes it really easy to have a ring-based network. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. So so let's talk now about arguably the most common type of network, which goes by a bunch of different names. Some people call it Bernoulli network, Poisson random network, Erdos random network, after the famous mathematician Erdos. We used to work with him. And here you have a total contrast to what we've been looking at. We've been talking about 2 forms of local connectivity. Connectivity that's local in one space and local in 2 space. Here what we're talking about is a type of global connectivity. And in this sort of connectivity, any pair of nodes A and B exhibits the same chance of connection as any other pairs of nodes. Okay? So there's no locality, there's no preferential attachment based on sort of location in space or anything like that. You have, each pair of nodes has a certain chance of being connected. This network type has no preference for locality. There's no more overlap in the connections of 2 neighbors than among 2 arbitrary nodes. So in other words, if I'm connected with Joe, Joe and I are no more likely to have a certain other person in common. You know, if I know a different person, it's no more likely that Joe knows him than of any other person in the population. Normally, there's a lot of these triangles. If I know a person, if I know Joe, chances are we have a lot of friends in common. It's just the ways in which social networks form, and there's lots of reasons for that. This is not captured within these sorts of networks. You have this kind of high entropy sort of wiring. So you can pick a random network, and what's relevant here then is the connections per agent. How many connections are there on average per agent? What's very important to realize is this connection per agent is not it's not enforced. In other words, it's not fixed, it's not uniform over the space. Some people have more, some people have less. This essentially determines the network density. What fraction of all possible connections are there? Now, connections within AnyLogic happen to be undirected. So, if we have n nodes, how many possible connections are there for n nodes? Yeah, so n choose 2. You folks may remember that from combinatorics. and it's n times n minus 1 over 2. You may remember this also as sum of sigma from 1 to n, but for example, if we have two nodes here, one possible connection. We have 3 nodes, we have a possible connection there, we have a possible connection here, and a possible connection there. In which case, we'd again have n 3 times 2 over 2, right? So three possible, 3 pairs that could be connected. And so basically the density of the network, the fraction of all possible connections that are in fact realized is going to be 5 times n divided by this n times n over 2. Is going to be the appropriate density for this. So this is an average connection for agent. Some people have more, just by the luck of the draw. Some agents will have less. Okay. So a random network is actually very, very similar in its impact to continuous dynamic random mixing. So when we introduced models using Benson and system dynamics modeling, aggregate modeling, we had random mixing assumption. Who can remind me what the random mixing assumption was there for infection spread? Where did that come in? This notion of random mixing. That I'm not particularly likely to see a small subset of people. Instead, I sort of mix more or less evenly with people within the population. It actually came in at a very important point within infection disease spread. Exactly. So that's exactly it. So that's very good. So we had some number of people we saw per unit time, say C. So we had some rate about seeing people as a whole. And then we made the very strong assumption here. We introduced this assumption that if there were a fraction I over n population of people in the entire population who were infected, we would see on average C times I over n infected people within our own network. That's a very strong assumption, because it's kind of assuming that the people with whom we come into contact with are in some sense representative for the whole population. But if things propagate locally, you know, in our particular area, there may be no one infected, but in other areas, there's a much larger fraction of people infected. In other words, the infection may be very localized, like we saw on the very first day of playing with an agent-based model, where we saw that infection spread out. And all the action was occurring on that periphery. It was like wildfire. It was all occurring in that ring around. There we have very localized areas where, you know, there's high infection in one place, and it's really, really dense in terms of rates of infection. And in other places, it's very, very sparse. This matters, it turns out. We'll see in some cases that this turns into a poor approximation. Well, it turns out that if you want to simulate random mixing of this sort within a network context, if you want to impose a network, that is, which exhibits this sort of behavior associated with random mixing, a random network, a Poisson random network, will do a pretty good job in many cases. Why? Because we again don't have locality. We again don't have the situation where I have just certain neighbors near me who are infecting me. Instead, we have this broad set of people to whom with whom I can come into contact. In other words, connections can be global and commonly are global. There's no preference. I have connections. It would be as if I have equal connections with anyone around the world as to someone in Saskatoon. You know, that could lead to very rapid dissemination, for example, of ideas or norms or what have you. So if you look in an agent-based model, shown here in red, where we have stochastics, and then we have some corresponding aggregate model, if we impose a random network, even for a nonlinear model, you may get great similarities in behavior between the two, because the random network captures the phenomenology of sort of random mixing so well. Now, this is despite the fact that a random network is different from random mixing in one respect. Can anyone tell me, when I impose a random network on this model up front, and I run the model all the way through with that network, how is that different from random mixing that we were talking about with an aggregate, within an aggregate model? How is it different from sort of this whole assumption? There's one important difference. Can anyone tell me? Network changes, exactly it. So it'd be as if the random network was reshuffling, every, continuously. And even without that, though, that's the striking thing. You get absolutely similar patterns, despite these persistent connections, despite the fact that I'm continually connected with the same person across the world in all these different countries. You can get something that's very, very similar to random mixing. So it's quite appropriate. So if we have random connections, we'll have people connected all the way across the network promiscuously, without regard for their locality. People are connected up in a sort of jumbled way, associated with just random pairing, as it were. Now, some individuals, as you'll note, some individuals have more connections and some have fewer. This one, for example, is 4. This one is 1. This one is 2. These two have 2. Here's another 4. Here's a 3. So there's variability. Some have more. This one's 6. Some have fewer. I think the average here is 5. So you can have some variability just by the luck of the draw. Okay. Let's talk about scale-free networks for a moment, bearing in mind that we're going to have a separate lecture on them because they exhibit really interesting properties that's suggested in part by their name, scale-free. They exhibit what's called power law distributions and sort of self-similarity at different levels of resolution. What they're designed to capture is a phenomenon seen in many areas of contagion, whether it's ideas, norms, infection, as to the importance of heterogeneity. The idea here is someone with a high number of partners, for example, is both more likely to be infected by a partner and more likely to pass the infection on to another partner if infected. So they're both at greater risk of getting infected and have more influence if they do get infected. Because of this, they have a disproportionate impact on the spread of infection. And if you can work with those sort of individuals, for example, in infection spread context, you can get really great bang for the buck. These are the folks that can be the tail that wags the dog. These are the folks that can disproportionately, change the course of infection. And as a result, we could see very different infection rates in high contact individuals than people with lower numbers of contact. We'd often expect to see larger rates of infection there, and for those rates, they spread it on more readily. Now, we're gonna ask later how to modify classic equations, the sort of equations we wrote down earlier, to account for this sort of heterogeneity. How does this affect infection spread? And the general principle is that it does infect it. Do you think it would decrease or increase the spread of infection if you have, once you reflect on this, if you have heterogeneity, if you have variability, maybe there's some mean C, but some people have greater rates of contact and some people have less. It just averages out to C. Do you think that would lead to greater spread of infection or less spread of infection? Or spread of X, where X could be infection or ideas or norms or attitudes or what have you, innovation. What do you think, how is it going to nudge it, higher or lower? And why higher?
Most connected people are going to pass it to other most connected people very quickly, so you get these
That's right. The people who are at the position in a position to pass it to the most people, to pass it most efficiently, to pass it most, disseminate it most widely, are more likely to be infected in the first place. So that's going to disproportionately sort of nudge up the infection rates. You've placed in the hands of the key people a greater risk of being infected. So here you can have infection spread quite quickly. Now, it turns out that networks that exhibit tremendous heterogeneity, where you have these very long tails, let's say, high tail risk, you'll sometimes hear it talked about, the long tail, heavy-tailed, they're often associated with what are called scale-free networks. And in a pure scale-free network, a node's number of connections is denoted, we'll denote it K. And the chance of having K partners or K connections is proportional to K to the minus gamma, okay? Now, this may look mysterious, but we'll talk about the meaning of gamma in a second. For human sexual networks, for example, gamma is between 2 and 3.5. Let's talk about what that means. If gamma is 2, it means if you count the number of people with exactly K connections, okay, that number of people with K connections will be 4 times, that's 2 to the 2, times as many as those with 2 K connections. So if I have 10 partners, then there will be, well, if we have a group of say 100 people with 10 partners, there are likely to be 25 with 20 partners. In other words, if you scale up K by a certain factor, you'll scale down the proportion or the number of people by multiplying times K to the minus gamma. Here it'll be 1 over 2 squared, or 1 over 4. So this gamma is going to give a sense of how heavy-tailed it is. If gamma is 1, it's decreasing extremely slowly as K increases. You've got a lot with high K. Doubling K, for example, is just going to have the number of people with double K. Each successive doubling of K just leads to success of halving of the fraction of people with it. On the other hand, if K is 2, it decreases more quickly. With 3, it decreases less. And we're going to discuss scale-free networks in another lecture here. Maybe today, maybe next time. Let's talk, so this is an example of a scale-free network. Here we have some nodes with lots and lots of connections, for example, but most nodes have rather few connections. So here, for example, 4, etc. AnyLogic does support this as a built-in network type. It will build up a scale-free network for you. And the scale-free network will have connection distributions. In other words, if we graphed out a histogram of the number of connections for a given person, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., what we would see is something in a histogram that matches this sort of characteristic. And in fact, it wouldn't look like this at all. This might be what we get out of a Poisson random network. What would we see out of a scale-free network based on these characteristics? Can anyone tell me? What would you see in a scale-free network in terms of kind of the distribution? Qualitatively. Yes, exactly. So it's going to be going down very, very rapidly in sort of an inverse polynomial sort of way. So it's going down as K to the minus 2, for example, 1 over K squared. So here we have a very rapidly decreasing distribution, but if gamma is small, it may be it will be less rapidly decreasing, for example. A small world network, there's actually whole classes of small world networks, but the most common form of it, the most classic form type of a small world network is sort of a weighted combination of 2 types we've just seen. It's a weighted combination on the one hand of a ring lattice network, and on the other hand of a random network. Now, that should be of interest to you. Among other things, a ring lattice network is a type of network that has purely local connections. A random network, a Poisson random network, has mostly global connections. So here you're mixing things of two very different sorts. It's like we have most of our connections drawn locally. In other words, we have connections with sort of neighbors, but we have a certain fraction that are drawn globally, that are drawn from with arbitrary people across the network. And in AnyLogic, there's this parameter, which we would see if you go to a small world network. There's this thing, not only connections per agent, but neighbor link fraction. And that basically leads to rewiring. So essentially 60% here are going to be with our neighbors in space, our neighbors in terms of a ring lattice. But then we're going to have 40% that are drawn randomly. Okay? So we're going to be hitched up on average to, say, 5 people. And you can imagine it wiring up things for a Poisson random network. It just picks arbitrary pairs of connections to connect, such that each person has on average 5 connections. And then it goes and it randomly perturbs those so that on average a certain fraction will be drawn globally. In other words, a certain fraction, neighborhood link fraction, will retain local connections. Okay. And one thing to be aware of is connections per agent for a small world network is off by a factor of 2 from what it is in a ring lattice network. Okay. So here we have a sort of mixture on the one hand of a highly local connection and of global connections. And the idea here was to capture, among other things, this was invented by Duncan Watts, who was a student of Steve Sorokatz's at Cornell. Steve being an impressive applied mathematician there who works a lot with networks. And what Duncan Watts wanted to capture was this effect of it's sometimes talked about as 6 degrees of separation. Does anyone remember what that represents? Can anyone summarize that? Yeah. So if you allow for 6 hops, I know so and so, you know so and so, they know so and so, and the next person knows so and so. You can pretty much get from one person to any other person in the world. So if I wanted to get a letter, for example, to someone in Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, or I wanted to get a letter to someone in Congo. I wanted to get a letter to someone in Iceland. I actually don't know anyone in any of those countries, but I do know people who know someone in some of those countries. For example, I knew someone who worked in Malawi. I know a bunch of people in China. I know people who have been to Iceland before. So I might give them the letter. And well, they've been there before, they met someone in the country, so they might pass it to that person. And within a surprisingly small number of connections, you could probably actually get it to its destination. And human networks do exhibit this sort of small world property. We are, it's true, we're connected a lot locally. I mean, there's just no disputing the fact that we circulate and are disproportionately shaped by people who are local to us. On the other hand, we often come with social capital, with connections that span beyond that. We know some people at quite some distance. Maybe it's someone who moved away, maybe it's someone that we met online, what have you. And so we do have the sort of primarily local connections peppered by these long distance connections. And if you calculate the network statistics on these sort of small in the world networks, what you end up finding is that you have this sort of quick connectivity. It's not like a Poisson random network where you have global connectivity you can extremely quickly get from one to the other, but within a certain number of connections, a fairly small number of connections, you can get to anyone locally. This is important because it directly bears on infection spread. How would you folks compare the spread of infection on the one hand with a ring lattice network compared with a small world network? Does anyone want to comment on that? Maybe I'll load in a model that might shed light in that. Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, for both to be reasonable, it's almost like the ring lattice network to be representing, well, I guess ring lattice might represent disparate communities that might have random connections in a certain way, but within those communities, there's small little ties, which is kind of illustrated
Yeah.
small little by the local connections.
Okay.
But except for the bad connections across the lattice.
That's right. Okay, so let me just open this guy up. So yeah, that's a very interesting consideration. I would argue communities are often connected up in a distance-based network. So if you have ties, for example, involving roads or ties involving rail connections or what have you, you know, you're going to have something like this. So here's a distance-based network where we're examining sort of the number of people infected over time. Here we have a type of infection spread that's predominantly localized. It spreads throughout these connections. Let me get this out of the way here so that we can see it a little bit better. We'll drag this out. Drag this out here, and we're going to see the impact of different types of networks. So the first is distance-based network, and here we have a spread of infection that is predominantly localized. So this is in 2 space, which gives it latitude to move in a broader set of directions than you have in a ring lattice. There's more ways to block a ring lattice, so to speak, than there is in this sort of 2 space. And yet you have this very localized connection. It can't just hop very easily. And later we're going to see the effects of percolation on this, just how big an effect that can have. Okay, now let's transition to a situation where we instead have a ring lattice network. So here we're going to go and set this to be a ring lattice. Now what would you expect? This is a localized infection type, but what would you expect to see? And in fact, beyond that, I think we'll lay it out in a ring, just so you could see it. What do we expect to see here in terms of infection spread? We haven't changed any of the parameters. It's spreading just as fast between any 2 people. But what are we going to see in terms of overall rates of spread, do you think? Yeah, it's going to be very slow. So each person can infect just 2 neighbors here, and it's actually much more fragile because if there's a blocker, if anyone is recovered along here just by happenstance, can actually block it from proceeding in that direction, and you're not going to have it proceed further there. So here we have it progressing along. I can speed it up here, but we could see it sort of moving out, but it's it hasn't nearly infected the population even by the infection end. Okay, so now let's go and look at this in the context of a random network. Okay, so here's a random network. We'll have it laid out in a ring just for ease of viewing. Here we have people connected globally, right? A given person may connect to others. And now there's kind of this indiscriminate, promiscuous connections. So now you're seeing this infection pop up across many places of the network. Why is it popping up at many places? Anyone? Why do we see this sort of nucleating at many places early on? Well, it travels globally, right? So here we see, you know, just after time, by about time 25, it's essentially everyone's infected. Why? Can anyone give a narrative to that? Why is it that almost everyone's infected like that so early on? There are far more connections. It can leap. It can go across broad areas very quickly, and therefore can disseminate much more efficiently, you know, across the entire network. Yeah.
Is there like a commonly used parameter for measuring, or not parameter, I guess,
Network
variable
measure.
for measuring the locality of a model?
Yeah, of a network.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's actually different different statistics, network statistics can be used to express the degree of locality, just how much locality is there. So, for example, there's a kappa statistic. It's a statistic related to number of triangles in the network that captures this fact of similarity between two neighbors and their own connections and so on. As you can imagine, random networks on one side of that and ring lattice on another. So there are ways of trying to capture locality in networks. There's also ways of expressing an individual's position in the network in terms of, for example, the number of connections they have. There's also something called betweenness centrality, on how many shortest paths is this individual located, which can give some understanding of how critical they are for, say, transmitting some contagion from one place to another. I may fold that into some of our discussion next time. Okay, so that was a Poisson random network. I'd like now to try a mixture between the two. So let's try a small world network. So here we're going to have, just as with ring lattice, we're going to have a small number of connections. But we're going to have 95% of those connections be local, okay? And only 5% be global. So what do you expect to see? When I call this up, what do you expect to see visually? Just phenomenologically. What should you see when I call this up? So again, it's 95% ring lattice, 5% Poisson random. How is it going to differ visually from what we've just seen? Okay, good. Yeah, something like that, right? So here we have these local connections and this, right? So here someone's gotten infected up here, right? So they're located up here, and actually you haven't, okay, now it's starting to transmit. And for the most part, early on, it's transmitting locally. But now we're going to see some additional action, because now this is seeded over here. Now this guy can start to spread locally here, and it's seeded over there via one of these connections. So, you know, one of the key features of the small world networks, and one of the real insights that came about from them, is that all you need is a few of these connections. It's not like all of us have to be, you know, worldwide cosmopolitans that travel the world very readily. All we need is a few connections, and actually you can get a spread of infection that's much more globalized than you would expect from a mostly localized structure. So here, this is another illustration of the general point that just a few people characteristics can make a disproportionate impact. It's not just that your average individual's characteristic. The average individual is overwhelmingly locally connected. Just like the average individual in a scale-free network has very, very few connections. But that is not the point. The point is that just a small number of important features, here global connections, scale-free network, large number of partners, can have a disproportionate impact on infection spread. So you may recall for the purely localized network, for the 1D network, within the entire time of the simulation, we had got maybe half the people infected, something like that. The infection kind of went up and stopped about here. Here we actually got the overwhelming majority. There are these sort of holdouts. Why are these holdouts there? Can anyone? Well, okay. In this case, they might have caught it if we had gone further. But in some cases, could you get holdouts that are not going to be infected, and why not? And why, rather? Yeah, it just blocks the infection. Exactly. So for example, you're never going to get anything coming from this side to infect this, for example. So you do get these kind of blocking phenomena, and that can lead to sort of holdouts. But a very small number of these connections can actually lead to a very rapid spread, just like a small number of high contact individuals can lead to a very infection spread. So it's not the average, the characteristics of the average here. Here again, we have this sort of tail wags the dog sort of situation. It can go local or go global quite quickly. And this is, in fact, one of the reasons why these days there's so much concern about, infection spread via air travel and so on. Because once it nucleates at several sites, then it can start to spread much more efficiently than it would if it were only spreading from a single original site. So here we go. Infection spread across the network. And, even if this had been a smaller fraction, if we had 97% of the connections, or 99, okay, maybe we're pushing it there, but it's going to materially speed it up. That's for sure. So here we have something like this, even with 2 global connections, and now we have this propagation of infection. Now, okay, so it's going to go up there, and then now it's going to probably leap across. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So there it hasn't gotten nearly as far, although it's interesting you get these sort of waves. Okay, so that's a ring lattice network. Let's go check out a scale-free network. Okay, what do you expect to see as scale-free, still arranged in this ring connection, which makes it easy to see? What would I expect to see for a scale-free network? Anyone? Based on my comments.
An infection will start, and then kind of disparate clusters might eventually get infected, and you'll see infections. Oh, we're still doing that.
Yeah, we're still doing ring layout, but you actually what you were saying though is quite right. So yeah, what's that?
It looks like the shape of the curve from the people are infected. It looks like it's always normal.
In terms of the people infected, you mean here?
Yes.
You're saying it looks like
Oh,
it
it isn't? Sorry, that was something else. Never mind.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a different sort of network. So here we essentially have, almost complete connectivity, or complete infection spread very early on. And it's because some of these people have disproportionate numbers of connections. I'm going to go decrease the coefficient here. So they have this M coefficient, which I define in one of my slides here, but basically has to do with sort of the density. You'll notice that some of these individuals have much larger numbers. And the key insight here is that it's not so much governing global connections, which are the distinguishing property of this network, but the fact that some individuals have large number of connections. And once you get to one of those large number of connected individuals, which you're quite likely to get to soon because they have their tentacles all over the place, and all you have to do is get to one of their neighbors, and then it gets to them, and then it explodes because they disseminate it really quickly across the network. So these guys down here on the right, for example, are going to be able to disseminate very, very efficiently across the entire network. Now, this is despite the fact that each of these individuals, in fact, has, on average, a fairly small number of connections. So, many of these, for example, have 2, these have 3, etc. But down here, we're sort of in the heart of darkness. And those individuals will, again, be the tail that wags the dog. They're going to have that disproportionate impact. They're going to be able to set the sort of the tempo for that impression spread.
That one person who isn't infected, what's their degree? How many infections do they have?
Well, that's a good question. So let's drill down.
Oh, I did read through all of them. It's probably about 4 in the end.
Sometimes brute force is.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Oh,
There we go. Okay, so
they only have
they have 4 connections. So they're kind of shielded a little bit by their connectivity, and they had 4 kicks of the can to get infected, so to speak. Well, for each of those, they had some kicks of the can, but by the luck of the draw, they didn't. On the other hand, okay, that's a good question. If I'm not sure we're going to be able to see it by going up here, but at least one of the connections may be.
One of them was with a high connectivity person, so maybe it was just.
Yeah, that person recovered. But you'll notice some of those individuals have a very weighty number of connections. Some of these individuals over here compared to them. So here we have a smaller number of these sort of highly connected individuals, and then lots with a much more modest number of connections, to be sure. But playing around with this, you can set the sort of number of hubs to be much smaller. So this parameter is proportional, I think, to something like I'll call up help. Sorry. Is proportional to, I think, maybe 1/2 the number of hubs. I define it in different places. It's a slightly obscure parameter. But if we were to have something like this, now we have just a few hubs here, and you'll notice those hubs got very quickly infected. They're among the first to get infected because, as I say, they kind of have their tentacles out, and then they disseminate it across the network. Interestingly, this network, this one seemed to have gone extinct very quickly. That's a really interesting case. So there, I think by the luck of the draw, it died out quite early. Okay, now that's they do serve as well. Oh, I think it is. I mean, I don't think actually someone with low degree necessarily serves as a choke point, because really what allows them to be choke points is not them remaining susceptible. It's actually them getting infected and recovering. Right? Once they recover, they can't spread it, and that's what allows the blocking area. It's like a pre-burn where you burn some area so that when the forest fire comes along, you burn under controlled conditions, so when the forest fire comes along, it can't spread over that area because it's pre-burned. So it's actually individuals who are already have gone through their infection phase that remain and are now recovered. Those are the fire breaks. Those are the bulkheads against further infection. And I don't think they're any more likely to be service as bulkheads if they have low degree as high degree. I think it's quite the opposite. They're more likely to remain susceptible for a while, but that's all the more fuel for the fire when it comes time for them. So it is true that you're going to need to balance the high degree with low degree, but those low degree individuals are still susceptible, and chances are some of them will be connected with high degree individuals. But this is an interesting case where, you know, we had just essentially one or two very high degree individuals, and it kind of petered out early on. Okay. In any case, those are some comments here. We're not going to have time to go too much further into scale-free networks, but I want to make some comments on this. I want to comment one other connection between networks and location and AnyLogic. So AnyLogic supports what's called a spring mass layout, which is basically a layout that tries to be intelligent about placing the locations of nodes, determining their spatial location based on who they're connected to. Okay. So we talked about two ways in which network layout type on the one hand, which shapes people's location, and connectivity on the other are coupled. One is distance-based connection, the other is the spring mass layout. Here, in distance-based connection, the primal thing, the most important thing, the governing factor is people's location, and their connectivity is depending on their location. They're connected, A and B are only connected if they lie less than or equal to 50 or whatever distance apart. By contrast, in spring mass layout, the location is governed by, in other words, the governing factor is connectivity. The governing factor is the topology. The geometry follows. So in a spring mass layout, nodes that are highly connected will tend to be clustered together. And AnyLogic's spring mass layout, I will say, it doesn't impress me too much in terms of its effectiveness, but it's okay. So I work with a lot of network data. This is an example of network substructure from 11,000 individuals here in Saskatchewan. And what you see is, in fact, a lot of clustering. It doesn't fit neatly into any one of the types of networks we've seen, but these individual clusters actually can match some characteristics, including scale-free networks that we've seen. And scale-free networks come up repeatedly in many, many contexts. But these network structures that we'll see are often much more textured than, but have important subcomponents that are described by some of these networks we've seen today. So in thinking about the effects of interventions or policies, we need to recognize networks are often an emergent phenomenon. They're often driven by mobility patterns, for example, relationship formulation and dissolution. They're often not static quantities, in other words. And there's an interesting philosophical issue when we think about agent-based modeling, because so much of the emphasis is on generative, providing generative explanations. We like a model which isn't simply programmed in with certain patterns, but instead which reproduces those from more basic principles. It's almost as if we want to describe very simple rules and have it produce the patterns we see around us based on those simple rules, rather than building in hard coding, as it were, those patterns directly. And there's an interesting philosophical issue with some models as to what degree the networks that you build in agent-based models, you just dictate the parameters, and to what degree you have them arise, say, from mobility. So, for example, that model that you saw in Gregor's presentation, where you had mobility of deer and the emergence of herds. Did he talk about that at all? Herds emerge from movement. Animals joined together. These are aspects of mobility, and you could argue that what we could describe as networks, say TV transmission network or networks associated with flu transmission, that those are really more fundamentally driven by mobility or driven by our patterns of spatial proximity. And maybe those are the more primal thing, and the networks instead are just a layer atop, an abstraction on top of that. Maybe when we think about interventions or policies, we should be thinking about mobility first rather than imposing a network on there. So you know, we want to think about that. What we've looked at here are dynamic or static networks. And many networks are dynamic. And it turns out AnyLogic makes dynamic networks, building dynamic networks, really easy. And we'll see if we can play around with that in some of the next lectures. But even though we know many networks are dynamic, traditional measures rarely, a way of quantifying the world, rarely yield dynamic high temporal resolution data. In other words, it's hard to observe the details of network dynamics, the formation and breaking of connections, as easily as we can observe network structure as a whole. So often we have very partial information on network structure, and they're often collected with a non-random sampling process, and they're quite specific to this notion of contact. So this, for example, is collected over 25 years. And what we see here, this is among 11,000 individuals with TB in the province, and what we with TB who are exposed to TB. And what we see is a network structure that actually, on a year-to-year basis, evolves. We have breaking of connections, formation of connections, due to friendships forming, families, you know, people being born into families, people dying, people moving to new areas that break connections, etc. So a given individual here may move from this community to this region to this region. And in fact, these clusters are highly associated with communities and sort of regions in space. So that's why you have the clustering. This is predominantly from Saskatchewan's north, where you have these more isolated communities. You know, just when you look at network data, be aware that what you're looking at is an abstraction. It abstracts often over the process that drives the formation of the network, and often over the dynamics of the network. Now, we here, our group happens to work with a smartphone-based data collection, and we collect data on network structure on the order of every 5 minutes. And so we see a very dynamic pattern of networks. The amazing thing is, some of the things we'll be talking about next time, like power laws, feature very prominently within that data. Highly dynamic networks, connections are formed and broken on a multi-minute level basis, but we'll see some of the same hallmarks that we see with scale-free networks in the context of this micro data. And we also see some additional patterns associated with sort of the dynamics of network connectivity. Okay, just some caveats on this before we break. Built-in networks that we've looked at are handy for routine tasks, but they don't directly offer much flexibility, for example, for preferential attachment, representing the fact that, for example, people with similar ages are more likely to associate with each other. Constructing the built-in networks can, particularly scale-free network, can in some cases be computationally expensive. I comment on the M parameter, and it's approximately, mean number of connections per person is approximately twice that value. And then there's this sort of inconsistency with small world network. But these are just some warnings about AnyLogic's implementation. Right, and we'll talk a little bit next time, I think, about some of the network dynamics in AnyLogic's. AnyLogic's environment or networks can be applied. So if you have a changing population, for example, people coming into the population in a distance-based network, you can call environment.apply network to get it to recalculate the network and include the new node. So you can tell it basically reform the network considering the updates, and it will do so. And these are some of the methods for connecting people. Agent A.connect to agent B, for example. Note that the connections are assumed to be undirected and symmetric. So if A is connected to B, B is connected with A. That's built in. You could build asymmetric networks. You could build networks with directed instead of undirected connections. But to do so right now, you have to form your own data structures to keep track of that information. I have examples where I have custom network data structures. You can have agent A.disconnect from agent B. And for more details of this, well, I may include it later. Here are some other methods for dealing with it. Agent A.get connections number, gets the number of connections, is connected to, returns whether they're connected. They can get the connected agent agent 0, 1, 2, and you can get all the connections for a given node. Okay, I think I'm going to drop it there. I want to leave you with one puzzle. You'll notice you'll notice in our discussion of infectious disease data that we saw the case of a network where people are born and people die and an infection spread in it. And we noted that the infection went to an equilibrium. You folks may remember this. We analyzed sort of this whole dynamics associated with the decrease in the susceptible population and buildup. What was this buildup here due to? Does anyone remember? We have this buildup in the number of susceptibles. So the infection outbreak occurs. We have a drop in the number of susceptibles. Why did it build up again? What do we have going on? Okay, this is built up in susceptibles, so no one's becoming susceptible again. That would be true if you were having people go back to a susceptible state. But why do we have an increase in the number of susceptibles? Good. Yes, that's right. The infected population will be decreasing as long as they're not infecting more than one person per infected over the course of their illness. So that's actually still dropping here, even though the number of susceptibles is rising. But it's a demographic process that caused this to rise. This is only in an open population. It's just because of birth or immigration is occurring at rates higher than people are being infected. So remember that's a stock, and the outflow is greater than, or the inflow is greater than the outflow now, and so we have a buildup in that stock. But the notable thing here is that we had this decrease, and we had these waves, but it reached some equilibrium. And yet, when we look at data for things like childhood infectious diseases, we see these waves, but these waves don't die off. They look like this. This is chickenpox here in Saskatchewan. This is measles and mumps in Saskatchewan. This is measles in England. This is pertussis in England. We see these persistent sort of spikes in infection. There are waves. There are waves quite like this, but they don't just die out. They don't just equilibrate. They stay pronounced. I want you to think for Thursday, why is that? Why is it that those waves keep on occurring? Why is it that we don't just sort of go to some equilibrium? And I think you'll find, actually, and I'll give you a hint, if you try to build up a system dynamics model, if you think about the right thing, if you think about there's kids and there's adults, and there's kids are turning over, the number of kids are turning over much faster than the adult population, so you get very rapid rises here in the number of kids after an outbreak. But you'll find for any system dynamic, any aggregate model, say built-in system dynamics, built-in Benson, or AnyLogic, you will find that it goes to some equilibrium. You will not find that it, unless you impose seasonality on it or something like that. And I would argue that these outbreaks that we're seeing here are a sign of something else. I want you to think about that, and we'll talk about it on Thursday. Yeah?
Does it have to do with mutation?
Okay, so for some bugs it does, big time, like for flu, for example. That's why we have flu outbreaks that outbreak every year. It's because it's evading our immune systems. We can't build up long-term immunity because it mutates and it tricks our immune system. And so that's occurring big time. This is actually a different thing. It's not a matter of immunity. It's a new group of kids that are getting infected every time. The question is, why aren't they just getting infected by the group that was infected earlier? Why is it there's such a pronounced spike? And we'll be talking about that next time. We'll see a little model which illustrates this, okay? Okay, so that's good. I'll announce my office hours, my 2 office hours for this week in email probably tonight, okay?